Chapter 3 Battle of the Atlantic. Remember that your life's vocation, deliberately chosen, is war. War as a means of peace, but still war, and in singleness of purpose prepare for the time when the defence of this realm may come to be in your keeping. Alston's Manual of Seamanship, 1865. However loathsome a way of settling international differences modern warfare is, if the Second World War had to come about, it started at exactly the right moment in my lifetime. I was 26 years of age, I was unmarried, I was fully trained in the profession of arms, and I had not to give up a civilian job in which I was just beginning to make my mark. I may be excused, therefore, if I admit that I entered the arena with confidence and looked forward enthusiastically to whatever part I might be called upon to play in defence of the realm. It was in buoyant spirits, then, that I stepped ashore in England on the 6th day of October 1939. Much as I had enjoyed 2 wonderful years in Australasia and the South Pacific, I had had enough of the good life out there as a privileged person and wanted to get back to the Navy before I lost my sea legs completely. I was also anxious not to let any of my classmates steal a march on me and be first into battle. The train from Liverpool took me straight to London, where I made my way to the Admiralty. England at war looked serenely beautiful in its autumn colours, but barrage balloons were flying over the main cities. Men and women, many already in uniform, were everywhere, hurrying about their business in a purposeful way, as if, having been kept in suspense for so long, they now wanted to get on with the war and get it over. I boldly entered the second Sea Lord's room. "Come in, Lombard-Hobson. You're the very chap I want to see," he said in the same encouraging tone as he must have used to others reporting for duty. "I've got just a job for you. You'll need a good shakedown after all that poodle faking you've been doing in and out of drawing rooms of late. Anyhow, your Governor-General reports well of you. I want you to go as First Lieutenant and Second in Command of a destroyer, which is very nearly ready for sea. So get your sea boots and your sou'wester out and off you go." In another office I got my official appointment. HMS Whitshed, on commissioning from Reserve Fleet, Portsmouth. I could hardly wait. Second in command of anything as a lieutenant sounded fabulous. I raced home, greeted and bade farewell to my mother in almost the same breath, and took train to Portsmouth with the minimum of luggage. In time of war, names and whereabouts of warships are never disclosed to unauthorised persons. I had therefore to dismount from the taxi when it reached the dockyard main gates, and identify myself to the naval police before learning where Whitshed was berthed. I told the driver to take me to number 27 dock. "Fine ship, the Whitshed, sir," he said as we weaved out through the maze of railway trucks and cranes. "Did great work in the last war." So much for naval security. The reader will recall that Whitshed was the ship which, 7 years earlier, had taken me on a shooting trip in the Mediterranean. At that time she was painted overall in the pale grey station colours with black waterline and looked very smart with her bright work glistening from stem to stern. The ship which confronted me now presented a very different picture, more like a hulk than an ocean greyhound. She had one funnel suspended overhead from the jib of a crane, and her decks were littered with welding and drilling equipment, in and out of which swarmed dozens of dockyard workmen. The ship I was about to join was one of 64 destroyers laid down under the 1916-18 emergency war programs, given names beginning with the letters V or W, and hence known as the V and W class. They proved to be about the most successful ships of their kind ever built for the Royal Navy. The Whitshed displaced 1,500 tons and had achieved speeds in excess of 33 knots. Her armament consisted of 6 torpedo tubes and 4 4.7-inch guns. Her complement was 150 officers and men. A number of these ships had been kept in commission between the wars, the remainder relegated to a mothball existence in the reserve fleet. All of them were now hurriedly being brought forward for further service. My spirits fell as I literally had to scramble on board. I could not imagine any ship in her apparent state being fit to go to sea before the following year. I felt my way below, in semi-darkness and to the deafening sound of pneumatic drills and escaping steam, to report my presence to anyone who might be of interest. I found the captain, who greeted me as a drowning man grabs a lifeline. "Thank God you've arrived," he said. "The ship's in a frightful mess, and we've got to be ready to sail in 10 days' time." He explained that the officer who had originally been appointed as first lieutenant was not up to the job and had been sent packing. "What experience have you had of destroyers, and where have you just come from?" I replied that I had been in the ISIS for a few months and had spent the past 2 years ashore on the staff of the Governor-General. "Good God!" he exploded. "The commissioned gunner who joined the ship a fortnight ago was out of the Navy for 18 years, running a stall at Covent Garden, And now you, wet nurse to a governess for 2 years. What the hell am I to do with you all? He then smiled, and I saw at once that our skipper had all the experience and the weight necessary to carry our dugouts and new boys on his broad shoulders, through the many mistakes we would make in the initial stages. Commander E.R. Condor was wearing First World War medals on his chest. He was very senior and had been in destroyers for most of his career. I liked the cut of his jib and, quickly putting myself together, resolved not to fail him. I soon discovered that only a month before, Condor had had an argument with a German mine. His ship was one of the first to have been lost in the war by this means. He was lucky to have survived, having been blown off the bridge and picked out of the North Sea some hours later by a trawler. Although he was suspected to have broken a neck, he managed to persuade the hospital authorities that this was a legacy from the previous war and that he was perfectly fit to go back to sea. Condor was, and looked, a mighty strong man, and our young medical officer assured me that it would take more than a mine and immersion in cold water to put him out of action. The other officers included the chief engineer who, like the captain, knew his job backwards. The second lieutenant had failed to qualify as a pilot in the Fleet Air Arm, which I thought was impossible, but he proved an excellent officer, and nothing ever seemed to upset him. There were 2 other lieutenants, a commissioned gunner, a sub-lieutenant and a midshipman, Royal Naval Volunteer Reserve, who had never been to sea before, and who looked so young it was a shame to take him. The medical officer, until 3 weeks before, assistant to a heart specialist in Harley Street, was now wearing the uniform of a surgeon lieutenant, Royal Navy Volunteer Reserve. He was to distinguish himself in the ship and make a splendid messmate. Our very mixed crew ranged in age from boys of 17 to real old buffers of 58. We knew nothing about their previous history, but after they had worked around the clock for a fortnight, we had the measure of them, and they had their ship more or less ready. The Admiral Superintendent of Portsmouth came on board, and after a brief inspection declared us fit in all respects for sea and for war. The ship sailed for Plymouth, where exhaustive trials of the main engines and of all the fighting equipment were carried out. We then camouflaged ourselves by painting the ship a mixture of dark grey and green, superimposed on which were splashed zigzag lines and patterns in black and brown. The Commander-in-Chief of Plymouth, Admiral Sir Martin Dunbar Naismith, my old Victoria Cross captain from Dartmouth days, came on board without ceremony to wish us good luck. Standing on the forecastle capstan, he outlined the hardships and dangers that lay ahead, and said that he was sending us out into the Atlantic to join the other escorts of a large convoy of ships from America. He concluded his few words by saying how much he wished he could come with us, and I am sure he meant it. Until we had cleared Land's End and was dipping our nose into the heavy swell from the Atlantic, I had no idea of how out of practice I was. Like everyone else on board, except the captain and the few odd hands at the game, I was as sick as a dog for the first 12 hours or so. The weather was foul at the start, the ship leaked, and we were all wet and miserable. By the second day out, and clear of the influence of land and the continental shelf, we were riding comfortably to a long swell in deep water. The skies brightened and our spirits rose. Quick to note the relaxation which accompanied this easing of discomfort, the captain pressed the alarm bells on the bridge, which sent us all flying to our action stations. 3 minutes later, I reported to him that quarters were manned and at the ready. We spent the next hour going through action drills and testing every weapon. At dawn on the next day, the masthead lookout reported, "Ships on the horizon." The sun was shining, the sea was calm, everyone on board had found his sea legs. It was good to be alive. The sea is an unnatural element for man, and his system revolts against it. Nearly everyone feels sick, or senses some degree of nausea, on putting to sea. Chronic seasickness in man, fortunately, is rare, and few are upset after the first 24 hours. Temporary relief from it can be gained simply by vomiting. Horses, on the other hand, are incapable physically of being sick, and when subjected to the motion of a ship, usually die. As with sleep, which needs topping up regularly, immunity from seasickness cannot be stored. The traveller who goes ashore for more than a month of hours during a voyage will lose his sea legs, and on resuming the journey, he will have to go through the 24 hours breaking process all over again, suffering that feeling of queasiness and midriff, or worse, as the waves and swell take over. I am a Mr. Average to poor sailor. I once asked an old trawler skipper if he knew of any trick to prevent this recurring penance at the outset of every voyage. He replied, "You must take charge of your stomach and your breathing. Lash your belly to your backbone. Then let your guts roll around and learn to breathe with the motion of the ship." His method was simple. Put a wide belt round your waist, and when you are strapped it as tight as possible, take in another notch on sensing that the ship or boat is on the crest of a wave. Catch a breath like you do in a lift, ready for the drop. Likewise, in the trough, stop breathing momentarily as the vessel starts to climb. With a little practice this becomes automatic, and you do not have to think about it any more. The old salt mischievously concluded his lecture by telling me why the Royal Navy is known as the Silent Service. You spend so much time in harbour, and on going to sea, you're all so busy having to hold your breath that you can't speak. Our first convoy consisted of 48 ships in 8 columns with a 2-mile frontage. Whitshed was ordered to take up a position in the surrounding screen of escort vessels, which was spaced 4 miles apart, and we quickly fell into step with a synchronised zigzag course being steered on either side of the mean line of advance. This is done to prevent the submarine at periscope depth in the path of the convoy from assuming the optimum position from which to carry out an attack. It is also designed to cause a U-boat to disclose its position on the nearest escort by having to use bursts of high speed, or even to surface, if it is to get into a firing position before the convoy passes out of range. The senior officer of the escort told us that they had had quite a quiet night, and that no U-boats had been sighted. He also passed to us, by signal light, all the operational information we needed, and we settled down to the routine work of an escort ship. Like any new ship to this task, we expected, or rather hoped, for action of some kind immediately, and we remained on constant alert. But after a short while realised that, to do the job properly, men had to be fresh, as well as ready. Sleep is as necessary as food. Documentaries and films on the Battle of the Atlantic have tended to mislead the public into thinking that it was plain bloody murder all the time, by giving the reader or viewer a vivid picture of frightful slaughter, lasting many days and nights, and resulting in appalling losses. Monsarrat's epic story of the U-boat war certainly describes every convoy passage as one long night of terror and destruction, and every ocean crossing a relentless struggle against the cruelest of cruel seas. In actual fact, taken over the whole period, the great majority of convoys got through without interference or mention, and the Atlantic, more often than not, is agreeably kind. For that whole first winter of the war at sea, Whitshed was employed shepherding convoys both ways across the Atlantic. By the turn of the year, the ship was operating perfectly, and with a first-class crew, and a great skipper in whom we had complete trust, we felt we could meet any challenge. Condor was a tough man who needed very little rest. He had no fear of anybody or anything. When not laughing, which was rare, he would be in a towering rage over nothing very much, which was frequent. He had one weakness in his armour, and that was convoy stragglers. After a dull night, with no alarms or incidents, he would go up on the bridge before daylight for what he called sheepdog trials. If he spotted even one small ship, albeit bigger than ourselves, which had had difficulty in keeping up in bad weather, and had dropped a long way astern of the main body, he would turn Whitshed round, and at speed of up to 25 knots, he would race through the columns, waking up everyone in the convoy as he bellowed through his loud hailing equipment to each past ship that there was no alarm. "Just going to shake up the buggers in the rear." Once close alongside, a straggler of whatever nationality, he would call the master onto the bridge and in nautical language tell him that he was endangering the convoy, and that if his ship was torpedoed, his crew would be left to swim for it. The usual reaction was a friendly wave of the cloth cap or a contemptuous digital V sign, as the master returned to his bunk, followed in most cases by clouds of black smoke emitted from the funnel of the little ship, as more coal was heaped on the furnace in an attempt to catch up. Condor's shepherding act was, thus, counterproductive because the smoke cloud was God's gift to a U-boat over the horizon. He would immediately inform the German Admiralty by radio of the position of the convoy. If there were more than a few stragglers after a dirty night, the only sure solution was for the whole convoy to reverse course for half an hour, to enable low-powered steamers to catch up, but this was an unwieldy and hazardous manoeuvre. Condor was often criticised by commodores of convoys for his pugnacious behaviour, and he was once reported as being a menace on the high seas, but his ship's company loved him dearly for his wild escapades, and he certainly kept morale in Whitshed at a high pitch. A factor which contributed greatly to morale, and so to our efficiency, was that we all felt so incredibly well, and this despite the lack of amenities and the really dreadful living conditions aboard an overcrowded old destroyer like ours. The bridge of a warship in those days was wide open to the elements. When the bows dipped into a heavy sea or swell, the spray drenched everyone. By day, it was possible to dodge these icy duckings, but at night you got it full in the face. On deck, gun and depth charge crews, signalmen and lookouts were exposed to all weathers. Engine room and boiler room crews in their overalls had to run the gauntlet of a dash along the upper deck, and frequently took a soaking from a beam sea before they could open the manhole leading to their positions below the waterline. Between decks, everyone had to live wet, eat wet, and sleep wet, because it was not practicable to change out-of-action clothing and, at the same time, be instantly ready for battle. Although the food was good and plentiful, cooking facilities were primitive, and even in a moderate sea, many dinners ended up in the assortment of paraphernalia swirling about under the mess tables and living spaces. It was utter hell, really, but we would not have changed places with anyone. There was no illness on board, except between convoy trips, and men might be able to go home for 24 hours. They would return with all the complaints brought on by overexposure to too much comfort ashore. Hot baths, heated rooms, and crowded cinemas. But these troubles would all disappear as soon as we put to sea again. The blue water cure is often a better remedy for minor ills than any remedy the doctor can prescribe, and a short, sharp dose of seasickness is the finest treatment for a hangover. Condor revelled in these harsh methods. After a couple of nights in port, he would drive the ship specially hard into a head sea, using more helm and greater speed than was operationally necessary, to get the canker out of the system, planted there by overcaring mothers and too demanding wives, he would say. By late January 1940, Whitshed had been at sea in active service almost continuously since November. Once clear of the landmass, the weather was mostly kind to us, but in the approaches to the British Isles, it was invariably unpleasant, with gales, fog, and snow, which presented the convoy escorts with considerable problems of navigation. There were, of course, no navigational aids of any kind operating for the duration, and after being detached for several days and nights to hunt a U-boat in bad weather and low visibility, it was not impossible for a pair of escorts to be as much as 30 miles out in their estimated position. Without a glimpse of the sun or stars, the only hope sometimes was to sight a Coast of Command aircraft on patrol and humbly ask the way. On one occasion, Whitshed was bringing a convoy from West African ports up the English Channel to Dover. Visibility had been almost nil for the previous 2 days in the Bay of Biscay, and somehow we had to find the entrance to the swept channel off the Lizard. We were put on the map just in time by a smart lookout who spotted surf breaking over rocks, fine on the port bow. An emergency alteration of course to starboard was made to the convoy by sound signal, and all was well. The sharp-eyed lookout was rewarded by Condor with the standard prize for a first sighting report, a bottle of beer, cheap at the price of 6pence for saving a convoy. When our charges were safely inside the anchorage under the white cliffs of Dover, Whitshed returned to Portsmouth at speed, and looked forward to a night's rest in harbour. While alongside the oiler, a signal was received ordering the captain to report to the Commander-in-Chief. On his return, he sent for me. He looked tired. "Number 1, he said, "we're off again. We've got a secret mission to perform, and the ship's company are not to be told till after we've sailed." I responded with perhaps undue enthusiasm, and properly got my head bitten off. Anyhow, it would make a welcome change from endless convoy work. However tired or bad-tempered Condor might be feeling at the moment, our task was to take the destroyers Ardent and Acasta under our orders, and rendezvous with the battleship Revenge off Plymouth at midnight. The great old ship was bound for the United States with £10 million of gold bullion, a quantity of the nation's art treasures, and a number of VIPs on board. Whitshed led the way out of Portsmouth, and the 3 destroyers groped their way down the swept channel in a snowstorm. Knowing that there were no other ships along the route, we made the passage at high speed, navigating from marker buoy to marker buoy, which was quite a nerve-wracking exercise. Anyhow, for the leading ship, and despite the poor visibility, arrived off Plymouth on time to await instructions. In a short while, we saw the outline of a very large ship edging her way out of the Sound. As she passed, she signalled us, by shaded light, "Take station astern until end of swept channel. Speed 20 knots." With both Ardent and Acasta close astern, Whitshed inched her way close up in the wake of Revenge, so that, however much the snow or fog blotted out the battleship, the foam water churned up by her 4 massive screws would be visible as a leading mark. Condor maintained this tight formation throughout the remainder of the night, determined not to lose touch with the battleship and her priceless cargo.